when it starts. You are watching or listening to Strangers in Space, and for the next 60 minutes, we are going to be talking about season 14, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
Season 14, then.
Yeah.
It's our final season review, Matt.
Okay.
There's only 2 of us here. That's terrible, isn't it?
Have I done all the season reviews, or did you start before I started podcast?
Well, we started originally before you started the podcast, which is why we've gone on to redo the ones that we did before.
Okay.
Because we did them before with me, Lee, and Simon. And Mark, probably, I think. Yeah, it would have been while Mark was still on the podcast.
Right, okay. But so, I have now had the opportunity to talk about, this will be every Doctor Who story.
Yes.
Ever transmitted. Okay, fine.
Basically, yeah. So you lucky boy, eh?
Yeah.
Right, but before we talk about it, let's let our listeners talk about it, because there is a mass of comments, beginning with Jimmy Twizzle, who says he thought season 13 could not be beaten, but this comes pretty close. David Kitchen says, I really have nothing new to say. It's an amazingly good season with 5 brilliant stories and an average one. So I'll just repeat my love and admiration for Chris Boucher. Robots of Death is one of my top 2 or 3 favourite Tom stories. And The Day God Went Mad, he says, is also amazing. He's been deliberately a bit obtuse there, isn't he?
Provocative, I think.
Yeah. David, you're so provocative. Lance Harrington. I mean, whenever he talks about the cyber brig, he's obviously being provocative, because who could fail but to love that creation, right?
And he just can't stop talking about it. I just don't. Yeah, it's an iddie fix.
It's like a little obsession of his, right?
Yeah.
Lance Harrington says some great stories here, but I've always found Mandragora drags on a bit, and I've always found Face of Evil just plain boring. I rewatched it recently, and it's still boring. Talons, though, is my earliest Doctor Who memory, so it always has a place in my heart. Matthew Maisie says, is it one of the best? It holds one of my interchangeable favourite stories ever, and Talons, even taking modern appraisals into account, is still a showcase of how to bankrupt the following season. For the rest, well, they are good, but I prefer many other Fourth Doctor stories over them, if I'm being honest. And you guys won't get much of a chance to talk about the fab female actors in this season.
Okay.
Mainly because there aren't any.
No, okay. Fair enough.
I mean, Robots of Death has some, but the rest of it, not so very much. Tobias Cooper, glorious last hurrah of all the Hinchcliffe and Holmes era. Tom is still teetering at his peak, wobbles slightly into self-indulgence in places, such as Face of Evil. The budget just about keeps pace with inflation, and 2 of the finest companions of the series ever. Andrew Willis, one of those rare seasons where you don't grade from best to worst, you grade from best to really good, not a dud among them. Steve Cunniff, Mask is hugely underrated and Talons very overrated. Mask, Face and Hand are 3 stories that sum up my idea of Doctor Who. Rod Brown, surely one of the strongest classic seasons that simply bombarded my childhood imagination with wild ideas and imagery and left an everlasting impression. As absolutely heartbroken as I was to lose Sarah, Leela makes a significant impact with stories that really emphasise her uniqueness, and the Holmes-Hinchcliffe formula is at its peak. Alistair Thwaite says, I believe it was the great Vanessa Williams who once said, just when I thought a chance had passed, you go and save the best for last. Which I'm assuming is the latter part of that is probably his review of season 14, right? Adric Marks says, everyone keeps saying that Hand of Fear is average in general outside of the final 5 minutes. I personally believe Face of Evil is far more interminable outside of the few great moments. Again, this season is all right, and I understand why everyone loves it. But this weirdo here, me, has never quite understood the mass appeal this season in its entirety has over many of the others. For me, it is overly talky and takes itself a little too seriously in a way that makes me feel like an observer and not a viewer. And the way they treated Sarah Jane midway through is enough to take this season off my favourites list, although it is definitely one of the most consistent in regards to quality in the series history. Phil Markham says, not a favourite season of mine. The Deadly Assassin is the best of a mixed bunch. Never really seen the appeal of Talons, hence bottom place.
Okay, we'll get into it.
Ian Charles says, love this season. Peak Doctor Who for me, not surprising given my age. Even Hand of Fear, which I placed last, I still enjoy greatly. Earl Eklund third, a fun-filled season for sure, with a pair of nods to Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie. Luke Hammond, saving the best to last, which is interesting considering the odd mix of Sarah Jane lingering over for a couple of stories, followed by an odd experiment in the middle, and then a classic trio of Hinchcliffe and Holmes bangers. I've often wondered whether Chris Boucher was being deliberately groomed as the next script editor, and whether his presence may have brought a greater stability and consistency over the following few seasons. That's probably not a bad point. Adrian Sturrock says this is definitely one of the great seasons ever, with 3 genuine classics, the underrated Mask of Mandragora with a couple of great boo-hiss villains and some lovely location work, some nice concepts in the face of evil, and a highly emotional farewell scene for Sarah, even if the rest of Hand of Fear is a bit dull. And Judith Paris as Eldrad gets a definite mention as one of the sexiest villains of all time. There's Adrian Sturrock getting his rocks on, I would have to say. Ian Barkley says, I had only seen Talons, so was looking forward to the Blu-ray to watch the rest. 5-year-old seems to really love the Hand of Fear. Okay. Tim Allman says, probably the weakest of the Hinchcliffe Holmes series. I can't agree with him on that. I suppose there's a consistency in 12 and 13, so really they're all much of a muchness in that regard. But, he says, when you have stories as strong as some of these are, that's just testimony to how good this era of the show was. We say goodbye to Sarah Jane, hello to Leela, and marvel at Tom Baker at his absolute peak. Sadly, it sort of feels like it was never quite the same after this. Shane Rowe says, an overrated series for me, probably due to the previous 2 being among the best of the classic era. I was 8 or 9 when these were shown, and for me, The Deadly Assassin has always been head and shoulders above the rest. And David M. Barsky says, best season of Who ever. Final thought, says Philip Hinchcliffe. Yes, that Philip Hinchcliffe, and how we'll have his comments on the individual stories later on. He voted in our polls, so we'll give you his votes as we go.
Good.
He says, I think my 3rd season was my best overall. Most of us were on top of our game by then. I like to think we were imaginative and took the show into new and exciting areas despite our limited budgets. When I saw the crew screening of Star Wars at the Dominion Cinema in London with Dougie Camfield and that opening shot of the massive spaceship above our heads filled the screen, I immediately knew it was game over. And in a way it was, of course. But miraculously, our unique little show has survived, and I'm constantly surprised that fans are still discovering it and enjoying it. Long may that continue. My best wishes to all, Philip, he signs off. Matt, I've been talking for absolutely ages. What do you think of season 14?
So it's the last season transmitted before I was born, which I'm just looking at the transmission dates. When did Star Trek come out? Star Wars come out?
Star Wars came
77,
out December 77. So okay. It came out after this finished broadcasting.
Yeah, so this is the last one before Star Wars as well. Before I was born, before Star Wars was released. I find it difficult to say whether this is the best, second best, or third best of the first 3 Tom Bakers. I think they are much of a muchness. I think they're really strong. They have 1 or 2 weak stories per season, and this is no exception. But I would say that the weak stories are debatable in this season. That I think the 2 weak stories have really strong points but weak moments to them. I would happily rewatch this one. There's nothing here that sort of acts as a roadblock for my if I was to start with Hand of Fear and just carry on, or Mask of Mandragora and carry on, then I would happily watch them all the way through, because every story has some sort of hook, every story has some sort of appeal. I do have my opinions about some. I don't think it takes itself too seriously either. I think this is possibly, I mean, it would be a sort of cliche to say that this is getting grimmer and grimmer as Hinchcliffe reaches its end, as he moves towards the producer of Target or whatever he did. But actually, I think things like Talons of Weng-Chiang, and as somebody said in the comments, it draws on Holmes and Agatha Christie. If you're drawing on Holmes and Agatha Christie, it's not taking itself too seriously. It's offering a kind of a pastiche of particular things, and as soon as you can recognize them, I mean, it's not full of jokes and kind of pratfalls, but it's this kind of oh, I know where they're coming from in this story.
It is quite funny in a sort of dry and sardonic kind of a way from start to finish, really, I think.
Yeah, and the Doctor dresses up in the different stories. I mean, this is the one thing I always forget about the Fourth Doctor is he dresses in the same sort of shaped outfit, but he dresses for the occasion. So Terror of the Zygons, he dresses in a particular way, and here he's constantly changing his outfit to suit where he is, or not to suit where he is. So there's a kind of playfulness. This is Tom Baker still enjoying what he's doing. He hasn't been kind of forced to inject kind of pratfalls or sort of improvisation, which he seemed to be from the scripts later on. He wasn't forced into a particular single performance as he was by John Nathan Turner. This is the one where he's still kind of got enough power and enough interest to kind of adapt his performance to suit what he's playing, but at the same time he's taking it seriously enough to just sort of to make the story the center of what he's doing and to give room for the other characters. So
he's still enjoying himself.
Yeah.
And he's still enjoying what he's doing. I think later on he starts enjoying himself rather more than he enjoys what he's doing. But here, I think the balance is perfect.
Yeah, and Elizabeth Sladen, you don't get the impression that she's run out of steam. You get the impression that she's finishing, at a point where she regrets it slightly, which makes it a little bit more emotional. And Leela coming in.
Louise Jameson.
Yeah. Louise Jameson. We know retrospectively now that she and Tom Baker had a sort of frosty relationship in these stories, but that kind of either doesn't come through on the transmitted stories, or it actually helps them slightly because Tom Baker's again sort of slightly more subdued at times, and she's kind of got room to do her own thing. She's not, even with Romani, even with Mary Tam, who was a strong actress, you always felt like she was in the shadow of Tom Baker's performance. Tom Baker was performing around her, whereas Leela is kind of, she has chance to sort of bed down her performance in these stories.
I think season 14, for me, my favourite of the entire classic era, really. And of course, I look back at it now and I see the problems. Somebody mentioned the lack of female characters, and of course, Talons of Weng-Chiang, we know what the problems are there, I guess. Yeah. So there are problems, but the combination of nostalgia and some really quotable dialogue and a lot of terrific performances. I think all of these stories have got some very strong performances in, mostly from male actors, but there you go. I don't know, the whole thing, I think everything about it is carried. So even the weakest stories are really carried by the performances and by some terrific sort of dialogue and ideas. There's lots of great ideas in this season as well. I think, in terms of sort of high concept Doctor Who, these are all high concept Doctor Who stories that kind of deliver on the high concepts. So they don't just thrust a high concept in your face and hope that that's enough, but they thrust a high concept in your face and then give it rich characterization and flesh the idea out, so that they really fill the 4 episodes, or in the terms of Talons of Weng-Chiang 6, really fill those episodes so that it doesn't feel in any of the stories like any of them start to drag at any point. Even Hand of Fear, which could potentially be the one that drags, each of the 4 episodes basically takes place in a different space, so it's continually moving on, it's continually moving forwards. The bottom 3 stories in this list are divided by 1.3% of the vote between all 3 of them. The top 2 stories in this list are divided by 0.4% of the vote. So in other words, the whole thing was really very close. Let's talk about those stories. In 6th place, on 25.5%, David M. Barsky says, it's hard to believe I'm placing this fourth, he says, obviously he votes it fourth then, as I love so much about it. It's founded on a trope we have all seen before, but very well executed here. Love the Hoarder, he says. Philip Hinchcliffe votes this one fifth out of his list. He just says memorable for Louise Jameson's debut. The Face of Evil, I think that's a really good story. I think some of the execution of it is a bit weird. I hesitate to say bad. Do you know what? When I watched The Face of Evil, it reminds me a little bit of like a Kubrick movie or something, in that I find it sort of slightly removed from reality, but I find it slightly removed from reality in a good way. So it reminds me of 2001: A Space Odyssey. You start with the apes and it feels very natural. Then you move to the spaceship and it feels very synthetic. And I think you've got that same balance here between being out in nature and being in a very sterile environment. And so The Face of Evil, and of course it has a very high concept, hard science fiction idea behind it. So this, to me, feels like Doctor Who's answer to 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I think it's a really good story, frankly. What do you think, Matt?
I would have voted it. It's quite low in my vote.
Yeah,
but in this
other
season,
stories
that's
are
fair
stronger,
enough.
yeah.
I think I like the concept. I think there is an artificiality about it, which comes from it being studio bound. So this is kind of a sequel to Planet of Evil, the two of evils, and I think.
But again, the sort of studio stuff that's actually in a proper film studio feels almost like location work, don't you think?
Not quite for me. This is where this story falls a bit down, because I think this season has a lot of really good sunny location work. I mean, Mandragora, Hand of Fear, Deadly Assassin, and Wang Chiang, they all have very, very good outside shots. They use their locations really well. Face of Evil, I think Planet of Evil was more successful slightly with the jungle, because that gave that kind of a claustrophobic feel. I don't think Face of Evil is quite as successful, but I don't think it needed to be outside. I think because it's such a conceptual story, it kind of gets away with it. And actually, the concepts do work. They are really interesting, and I think this. We talk about there being a lack of good female characters in some of these stories. I think Face of Evil, Louise Jameson is the strong female character. She's not quite the companion yet. So this in fact, the two Boucher stories kind of pull themselves back from being cockfests. There's only one or two stories, I would say, in this season, that maybe three, that are really kind of are guilty of that, two of which are by Robert Holmes.
Yes, but I think there's a reason for that. Shall we talk about that now, just for a second?
We can do.
I think Robert Holmes, he was a policeman before he worked on Doctor Who. He went from a very male society, which is sort of, I hesitate to use the term middle management, but sort of middle tier police detective officer. That's a very male environment in the 1950s, 1940s and 50s, which is when he would have been doing it. He goes from that very male environment to sort of middle of the BBC as well, middle tier BBC, which is another, at the time, very male environment. I think that it's not a deliberate choice. I think it's just him reflecting his environment in a way that shows he wasn't, whatever other boxes he was intelligent enough to think outside of, that was the one box he never sort of really got to grips with. So I think he just reflects his environment, and his environment is kind of middle tier, very male-oriented environments, and that's kind of what his stories are reflecting, because that's what his life had been for the whole of, you know, his adult life.
I mean, possibly, except certainly in this first season, in season, which one? Season 12, there are female characters, and there are clearly kind of gender-swapped characters. So he's written male characters, and the director has chosen a female character, or he's written female. So he does write strong female characters. I think in this instance it's because it's drawing on things like Sherlock Holmes and Fu Manchu and the Manchurian Candidate,
well, yeah.
And these are all kind of male-dominated genres. I mean, he's very, very sort of closely cleaving to these genres. So, you know, in conspiracy thrillers, generally speaking, of the 70s. they're all kind of male characters under threat, and Sherlock Holmes is full of. I mean, the main two characters are male, so it's Holmes and his close companion Watson.
Well, and the other thing as well, of course, is he doesn't arrive in adulthood as a writer. He's not gone to university to learn to be a writer. He's not been writing novels and plays and such. He's been a policeman. So he comes into the job at a later stage of life than most writers would. And I think, again, going back to my point before, I think you sort of arrive there with your ideas already fully formed before you, because when you become a writer in your late teens or early 20s or whatever and develop, your craft develops alongside your perspective. But I think he arrives at the point where he develops his craft after his perspective is already formed. Do you understand the distinction I'm making there? I think importing a perspective of this sort of middle management, male dominated society into a developing craft is perhaps what lands Robert Holmes where he is. And you're right. He doesn't always just write male characters all the time, but there is a heavy leaning towards it.
There is, but also it's up to the director as well, because we know now that in almost every season throughout Barry Letts, you have a male character gender swapped to a female character just through the casting of the actress without really changing the script, and that works perfectly well. So it'd be interesting to see Deadly Assassin with gender swapped goth, say. That would be. I mean, it would probably slightly improve Deadly Assassin. It would make it more interesting. But yeah.
Yeah, this was before they decided, or they'd accidentally arrived at the conclusion that you could have female Time Lords. Male-dominated societies. I kind of cut you off. Was there anything more you wanted to add about The Face of Evil, or should we move on?
No, we can move on.
Okay. Well, in fifth place then, or rather, sorry, in fourth place, because these two are both in joint fourth place. I'll do them alphabetically. Luke Hammond says, voting this sixth, a generic Evil from the Dawn of Time offering from the Bristol Boys, sorely lacking originality, and aside from a decent turn from Eldrad, no significant guest characters. Watching it recently, I struggle to see any element that isn't done 10 times better somewhere else in this era. Christopher Bryant also votes it sixth. In fact, all four of the people who comment vote this sixth. Bryant says, everyone lets the last 5 minutes obscure the fact that the previous 4 episodes have been fairly mediocre. Although mediocre in season 14 is still well above the rest of some other seasons, there's no denying the powerful iconography of the hand itself or the enjoyability of the catchphrase, but the other 5 are just better stories. David N. Barsky, such a great build-up that goes downhill fast. Such a shame Sarah spent so much of her last story as a babbling child, despite the sweet farewell. And Philip Hinchcliffe, who also obviously votes this last of the 6, just says, memorable for Eldrad, a striking female foe for the Doctor, and for the touching parting scene that Tom and Liz left us for posterity. And that is a lovely last scene. The story itself, I think The Hand of Fear is fun in a sort of third Doctor kind of a way, where some of the stories didn't really add up to a great deal. I love the stuff in the second episode with Glyn Houston, and especially the phone call to his wife that he makes. That is a wonderful addition to Doctor Who, the kind of scene that you don't normally get in Doctor Who stories. So I don't know where quite that came from. I think Bob Baker and Dave Martin are slightly underrated in that I always think they come up with something that's worth watching, but they never come up with the stories that are, go down as the absolute classics. They're not anything like up to Robert Holmes or Chris Boucher type level. And so when you have a season that's very heavily Holmes and Boucher, The Hand of Fear is obviously going to suffer by comparison. I think it's terrifically enjoyable Doctor Who. I don't think it adds up to especially much. Matt.
It features a memorable military bombing raid on the nuclear power station.
So which Dwells of Axos.
Which is great fun. It's really good to watch now.
Yeah, not very good this week.
No, I think this is my favourite Bob Baker, Dave Martin story. I think part of that is the direction and the way it's shot and the performances. I kind of disagree that Elizabeth Sladen is poorly served. I think kind of maybe the character doesn't show a lot of Sarah Jane Smith in certainly actually both of these two stories, these two final stories, because she's possessed. But the actress is conversely given quite a lot to do because she's doing kind of different forms of possession acting. And I think in Hand of Fear, certainly, she's really sinister, and she really sort of really demonstrates a powerful performance in this. And I think that's a good homage to Elizabeth Sladen's acting, if not the character. I think maybe Sarah Jane Smith had a better send off as a character in the last season, but as an actress, this is her at her best. I think it does, a bit like Pyramids of Mars, I think it does fall apart a little bit in the last episode, which becomes a kind of, as far as I can remember, a kind of a trudge through an interior studio alien world, and then the bad guy being tripped up and falling down a big hole, which isn't great. But as with Pyramids of Mars, I think the first 3 episodes have more than enough of interest and location work, and they've, as you say, it takes place in a different place each episode, which kind of really makes it look like an expensive story. It feels like they've spent a lot of money on this because of the different locations. So this wouldn't be my bottom choice. I think Philip Hinchcliffe is wrong.
I think I did put this bottom, but then, as people have pointed out, bottom in season 14 would still be pretty high elsewhere. And speaking of villains who get tripped up and fall down holes, isn't that what happens to the Master in the following story?
Oh yeah. but there's something about the following story.
Oh, it's very different.
There's something appropriate about the Master being tripped up and falling down a big hole, because it's still got that kind of Phantom of the Opera style kind of melodrama to it. Hand of Fear, as you say, is sort of more Pertwee kind of gritty realism throughout. Until the last episode, when it kind of moves location and shifts tone slightly.
It becomes Death to the Daleks, but except with sort of Azal or Sutek instead of the Daleks or whatever. It's slightly mad. It sort of goes from sort of fairly realistic in the first couple of episodes to slightly mad in the last 2, which is probably not the most comfortable of juxtapositions. But then again, this is Doctor Who, and that's the kind of thing that happens in Doctor Who all the time. A couple of years later, it does it in the Stones of Blood, and Stones of Blood's one of those stories that people love.
I love half of Stones of Blood.
Yeah,
certainly,
me too.
certainly.
Me too. Also in 4th place, and also therefore on 26.8%, Daniel West, who votes this 4th and who wanted to shine some love on it, says a cracking pseudo-historical with some great performances. David M. Barsky, I've always been a sucker for stories set in this period. Hieronymus is so wonderfully arch. He votes it 2nd. Also voting it 2nd, joint 2nd, Philip Hinchcliffe. I allowed him to do joint because, he's Philip Hinchcliffe, right? So, although I told everybody else they weren't allowed to have joint positions, I thought I'd let him get away with it.
If anyone's allowed to smoke a joint, it's Philip Hinchcliffe whenever he wants.
He says this demonstrated that we could tell a gripping story in a richly historical setting without resorting to monsters. Fabulous use of Portmeirion location. Mask of Mandragora, obviously, which I think in the context of season 14 or in the context of season 13 and 14, Mask of Mandragora comes across as a little dull because some of the dialogue and some of the characterization is a little straight. But actually, if you put this anywhere else in the whole of Doctor Who, this would be absolutely wonderful. Because I do think, yes, the location work is great, but also the characters really do feel like real people, despite some of the sort of fairly florid dialogue, I suppose. The villains are fantastic. And I think the story and the ideas are also really memorable too. I think, though, in The Ultimate Reckoning, Mask of Mandragora probably works slightly better as a novel than it does in the television version, despite all that wonderful location work. Because I think in the novel, the ideas sing, whereas on television, I just think it doesn't quite grip you in the way that some of the other stories around it do. I don't know. What do you think, Matt?
I think it's fairly dull. And I think Philip
Yeah.
Hinchcliffe is right that they use Portmeirion is brilliant with Portmeirion. But I think he's wrong in that it demonstrates that they can have a really good, strong story without a monster. I think probably needed the monster somewhere. It needed some sort of, because this is it feels a bit like I, Claudius, so it's got that kind of court intrigue thing
Yeah.
going on, but it doesn't go anywhere for me. It doesn't. It's sort of, it's there as sort of decoration rather than driving anything forward. And the Doctor is sort of involved, but he's slightly distanced from what's going on. So I don't know whether you're meant to be intrigued by the court sort of jockeying for power, or intrigued by the occult stuff going on underneath. But none of them really intrigues me.
Mhm.
I just don't know where it's going or what it's for. But it looks great. And
Do you remember the Vincent? I think it was Vincent Price. Oh yeah, it must have been the Vincent Price film, The Mask of the Red Death.
yeah.
Yeah, I figured you would. That came out about 8 years before this, and I think that was on telly quite a lot at the time this was being made. I think that was sort of fairly in the public consciousness at around this time.
Yeah.
And I think that's the context for this story, because
Yeah.
obviously we talk about what all the Hinchcliffe and Holmes stories are remakes of, and this was their version of The Mask of the Red Death. And it's called The Mask of Mandragora, so it's not as if they even attempted to hide it. But I think we lose that context a bit now, because whereas some of the other stories are based on things that are still fairly within our memory, because these things have stood the test of time, Mask of the Red Death, I think, has kind of disappeared a bit as a film. I mean, I know there are certain people who like certain types of films who will seek it out, but it's not the kind of thing you ever really sort of see on telly or hear about anymore.
I mean, the biggest problem with the Mask of the Red Death is it's not very good. So it's Corman, and it's based on Poe. And
Yeah.
Corman and Poe together, they create really atmospheric films that don't do very much. And I think in that sense, Mask of Mandragora is the perfect adaptation. Whereas Sherlock Holmes is all about plot, conclusion, twist, or Manchurian Candidate, plot, twist. Mask of the Red Death is more about kind of creepy castle, weird character here, intrigue over here. And I think that does get relayed into the Mask of Mandragora, but it doesn't have that kind of here's where we're going.
It's not
plot.
a million miles away from Hamlet, in that you're in a creepy castle and you're waiting for something to happen. And in Hamlet, you're waiting for 5 hours, right, for something to happen.
Yeah.
But it's all about the internal dilemma of the lead character.
Yeah.
Mask of Mandragora, Mask of the Red Death, probably. I haven't seen it since I was about 14 or something, I don't think. You're in a creepy castle, you're waiting for something to happen. And obviously the Mask of Mandragora attempts to be about this character's internal dilemma, but it's also a character's external dilemma, because we do know that his uncle really is as evil as we think he is, and we know that somebody else is evil. So there's not actually any dilemma. And maybe that's the problem. You can't tell a story about a dilemma unless you actually have a dilemma.
Yeah, or a big monster.
Yeah.
Those are the alternatives that would have made it better. So this is bottom of my list, but I think I agree that if you dropped it into season 15, 16, or 17, or 18, then it would be kind of a nice addition. It still wouldn't be tippy top, but it would be a nice addition to those seasons, just giving it a bit of, because of the way it looks, giving it a bit of history and historical texture, and it's a new location for Doctor Who, so it works well there. It just doesn't quite have the kick of some of these other stories.
Right, speaking of things that do have a bit more kick, the story that came in third, so that's not of the bottom three that were all together, and it's not of the top two that were together, so this is the only one that stands apart from the others. This is on 60.5%. David M. Barsky votes it fifth. He says, love this look into the Time Lords and the bizarre world within the Matrix is a trip, but a little unevenly paced at times. David Ewan votes it first. Says controversial, but full of rich Holmesian characterization and more new lore than any story has ever come up with. Dark and cerebral, a masterpiece. Philip Hinchcliffe just says groundbreaking for the series in many ways, but for him, it's only fourth. I think third is probably about right for The Deadly Assassin. I don't think it's the greatest. I think this is probably the one that perhaps does lack a little for a sense of humour, or for an obvious sense of humour. I think there's a dry sense of humour underpinning the politics of it and underpinning the sort of society that Robert Holmes portrays. There's definitely a dark sort of sardonic humour underpinning that, but it's never an obvious humour. And I think The Deadly Assassin, its one problem is that in the Gallifrey bound stuff, it feels a bit dry. Having said that, I like the Gallifrey bound stuff a lot. I like the Matrix stuff even more. When I was, what would I have been, 8, I suppose, 7 or 8, when I was first watching this, all that stuff in the Matrix was absolutely mind-blowing, but in the best possible way. David Maloney directs. I don't think Maloney ever gets enough kudos, but I think he makes of something, because a lot of this, the first 2 and the last episode, are basically all set in the same place, and it's all interior, and it's basically all the same sorts of rooms. It could have been horribly dull. I think David Maloney makes it incredibly compelling, and then does that episode and a half, whatever it is, in The Matrix. And I don't know if there's any other director who's done Doctor Who, certainly not in the classic years, who could have done what Maloney did with this. I think The Deadly Assassin's pretty decent. I don't think it's quite up there as the absolute very best of Doctor Who, but I don't think it's terrifically far off. And in the character of this master that we get here, what an astonishing addition to the sort of Doctor Who canon, really. Matt, The Deadly Assassin.
It's so these 3 stories that are kind of jockeying for, well, pretty much jockeying for top position. Yeah. I think they're probably, for me, all evenly at the top because they're so different. They've got their own character, their own personality. I think The Deadly Assassin has always been a favourite of mine. I find it really watchable. I find it really interesting. As you say, the Gallifrey bits have the risk of being, well, basically Arc of Infinity.
Yeah.
But they're saved partly by David Maloney, but partly by is it Jim Atchison? So costume design and set design all kind of come together to make interesting locations within the studio. They really kind of make the best out of the studio, and having that sort of Matrix episode kind of takes you out into a sort of fairly standard Doctor Who quarry, but somehow filmed in such a way that it makes it look like a kind of a 1970s action movie. Really well done. I think Tom Baker is probably, and again, Tom Baker's at his best in these 3 top stories, I think, but in different ways. So here, he's really allowed to be this kind of action hero, which you don't see him like that anywhere else in his run in Doctor Who. I don't think, not consistently like this.
No. I think The Seeds of Doom is probably the one example that's closest, maybe.
Yeah. But even there, it's slightly different. It's more, I don't know. He's just, that sort of Matrix episode really shows a part of the Doctor we haven't seen. It shows what I think Pertwee would have liked to have been, but his back wouldn't have let him do. So yeah, this is, I mean, I can't find any criticism. I can find a criticism. I think actually the plot is rubbish. I think the plot doesn't hold water in any way. It doesn't make sense.
The premise, rather.
The motivations, the motivations behind the characters. The conclusion is shonky, but the fact that none of those really mattered because it looks so good, because the performances are so good. I don't mind it being really serious because it is, as I say, this is sort of sandwiched in these kind of witty in different ways stories. So I'm kind of happy with that.
Yeah, fair enough. Right, top 2 then. And here's the big surprise, although it won't be a very big surprise for people who've been voting in our poll of winners, because I gave away the story that had won this one when I put up the list of stories that had won. But in second place, on 80.5%, David Ewan, votes it second and says more Holmesian dialogue to die for, and the BBC bringing out the period atmosphere like only they could. The morgue scene and the old Cockney crone are particular highlights. Steve Herr votes it first, says, wowed this innocent 9-year-old. Even the giant rat turned me into a scaredy cat. Great writing, direction, costume and performances. I nearly emigrated to Australia when this was unfairly released on VHS there first. David M. Barsky, there is no substitute. I even like the rat. He votes it first. And so does Philip Hinchcliffe, who says, a bravura end to the season and the best Doctor Who script Bob Holmes ever wrote, full of character, comedy and atmosphere, wonderfully handled by David Maloney. And yeah, David Maloney does seem to be Philip Hinchcliffe's go-to director for the big stories, especially after Doug Camfield can't carry on, I think, after season 13. Talons of Weng Chiang. You want to talk a little bit about, we've talked about the racism many times before. I guess we've got to give it 2 minutes.
I mean, think. Sorry, go on.
Well, I was only going to say, I don't think a lot of people point at, and the actor's name escapes me, who plays Chang. But I don't think the racism is there, because he is characterized as somebody who is deliberately putting on an accent, putting on a performance, and who ultimately turns out to be a victim in the story. I don't think the racism is there, although that's the most obvious place to point because of the yellow face, as it were, because of the makeup. But there are lots of other examples of that across Doctor Who up to this point. Lots and lots of other examples of that. So this story isn't distinguished by that. I think the racism is in the treatment of the Chinese Tongs. But then I think you can only say that's slightly mitigated, A, by the fact that this is basically a remake of the Fu Manchu stories, and that's where those come from. And B, just by the notion that if you're going to have sort of mafia type characters or sort of run of the ground sort of mafia type characters, gang members, as it were, and you're setting it in Chinatown, then that's kind of a necessity of the story. I think what the story lacks is the balance of having a sort of beneficent Chinese character, as it were. You only ever see the Chinese in this story being the bad guys. And while I think it's acceptable for the Chinese to be the bad guys, I think you need the balance of having other Chinese characters who aren't the bad guys, so that you're not just painting the Chinese as bad.
So I think there are two different sides to the racism in this story. I think I agree that Li Sen Chang, the sort of the celestial nature of his character, this kind of stereotypical kind of Oriental character, I agree that Chang is putting on an act for this.
Yeah.
But the side that is racist is the casting of a white actor in a Chinese role.
It's problematic, yeah.
Which is problematic, even if it's been done. The fact it's been done in Doctor Who before is immaterial. It's still problematic, and it's becoming more problematic at this point when in the 1970s it's starting to be recognised as being a problem, particularly when you have Chinese actors. In some ways, the Tongs, because they have sort of British Chinese actors cast in the role of the Tongs, that kind of helps with that. But again, the Tongs themselves are worrying. But you say it's drawing on the Fu Manchu, which are terrible books, really awful books, and terrible films, and they are racist.
I've only ever seen the films when I was about 10, so I couldn't really comment. I can't remember.
All I could do is trot out my how to make Talons of Weng Chiang today work by pointing out that the main Chinese magician of the time in reality was a Western European performer pretending to be Chinese. And so if you did that in a story and it reveals itself to be John Bennett, who is Western.
John Bennett, that's the name I was trying
to would be, that would actually add to the story, I think. That's sort of a Western character pretending to be Chinese. It's still slightly uncomfortable, but at least you've kind of made yellowface part of the story, and then it is actually true to history. It is something that happens in the Victorian times. So I think you can't get away from the fact that there are problems with that, and I think it does mar the story. But overall,
though, I think it's probably the most entertaining Doctor Who story that's ever been made, and again, slightly without monsters. Hinchcliffe doesn't seem to really like monsters. His comment earlier about the monsters not being in Mask of Mandragora, I think that kind of sums up his ethos for the series. I don't think he likes monsters. And so whereas he will do monsters or oftentimes villains in masks, for example, you know, Davros and Eldrad, for example, even, or in The Deadly Assassin, the Master. Sorry, God, I'm getting old. I can't even remember what I was talking about 5 minutes ago. He doesn't really like to do monsters as such. So the Talons of Weng-Chiang is a runaround without monsters, really. But it's, as runarounds go, I think this is where Robert Holmes really, really enjoys the characters that he's creating, because he obviously clearly loves writing this in the Victorian era, because that idiom seems to come naturally to him. And he clearly loves writing those two characters as well. And it's when those two characters join up in episode 5 that kind of, I think, is A, one of the best, and B, one of the worst moments in Doctor Who, because from that point forward, that's all they want Robert Holmes to do, and Eric Sayward, that's all he wants to do, and it becomes this thing. We talk now about the Robert Holmes double acts. It's not really a double act, it's just two characters who happen to share an episode together, you know, who've spent 4.5 of the episodes in this story entirely, you know, in separate storylines from one another. When they do get together, it's a great moment in the story because they're so well characterized that seeing them together, the script and the dialogue and the acting and the story really sings. But I do think that is kind of, you know, a bad example for the rest of Doctor Who to follow, because it does become this thing that they always want to repeat. Talons of Weng-Chiang, after it was released on VHS, became my favourite Doctor Who story. Prior to that, I thought the book was really dull because it had no monsters to speak of. When it was on television originally, when I saw it when I was whatever I was, 7 or 8 or 9 or whatever it was, Mr. Sin was terrifying. I remember Mr. Sin very distinctly. That was pretty much all I could remember about the story, really. But the Talons of Weng-Chiang, yeah, despite the problems, and, you know, despite what I said just now, they are problems. I still think it's my favourite story of the classic era, just because of how entertaining it is. So what do you think?
So I wonder, with Philip Hinchcliffe, he doesn't have monsters in this whole season, and I think it's a CSO thing. I think he's partly reacting against, I think Invasion of the Dinosaurs casts a long shadow over Philip Hinchcliffe. So he's looked at what Barry Letts has done quite successfully and thought, how can I do this differently? He tries a bit with the Scarrison in Terror of the Zygons, but that's kind of the only big CSO kind of organic element that I can really think of. I suppose the Crinoids were sort of stop motion.
Yeah, at the end.
Yeah. So I wonder if this season sort of stands out as being, there are actually no big organic.
Well, apart from the rat, I guess. But that's monsters, a rat, right?
Yeah, and again, it's a model. Yeah. So I think that's partly a story decision not to have these, to prefer humans in, or humanoid characters in masks, but also it kind of looks better. And I think that does help this season.
I think probably the main influence was how well Davros worked, and they probably just said, let's add more of that. Really, I guess,
because you didn't get sort of cackling villains in masks much in Barry Letts, or Omega, I suppose.
Yeah, but there aren't terrifically many though. No.
So Talons of Weng-Chiang, I think you could probably edit out a bit, and it would be releasable in the cinema as a Hammer movie. I think it looks so good. It looks so filmic and so kind of dynamic. Maybe take the last 2 parts, which do end up being a little bit sort of interior and a bit of kind of imprisoned and escape.
Yeah, the shootout at the end is not the greatest ending of any Doctor Who story. So although the hoist by his own petard is sort of a satisfying ending for Weng-Chiang, I guess.
So I think 5 and 6 are the bits that you could probably edit down or out. in order to make this into a feature film. But the fact that you could make this into a feature film in the way that it looks, I mean, in some ways, this is the Doctor Who feature film that Tom Baker and Ian Martin start planning at some point. Yeah, I don't know if it's my favourite of the classic series, but it's certainly kind of, it has to be up there. It has to be up there. The design work, and again, it is the design work and the direction working together, and the costumes. I mean, the BBC know how to do Victorian well. They know how to do Victorian Edwardian well, and this paired with Pyramids of Mars, they're completely different looking stories. They're different tones, but they work as the sort of the two poles of what the BBC do really well. And I think it's been ages since I've seen Tom Baker's Hound of the Baskervilles, but from memory, I think if Tom Baker had just been allowed to do his Sherlock Holmes like he does in Talons of Weng-Chiang, I think it would have been much more successful, and he could have just carried on in this sort of alternative Doctor Who character, Doctor Who Sherlock Holmes hybrid character, and you could have got like the classic serial.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's great.
In first place, then, on 80.9%, obviously the Robots of Death, David M. Barsky votes it third. Says, I used to avoid this one as a child, but now I appreciate the design, the story and direction. But I was also irked by the identity of the perp was so sloppily revealed.
Perp.
Alistair Thwaite votes it first, says the titular robots, he means the eponymous robots, are surely one of the biggest design wins in the show's history. Christopher Bryant also first. However good the others are, this is one of my all-time favourites. So quotable, so wonderfully odd, and full of eccentric and memorable characters. Tony Green says, astonishing they never brought the robots back, and even more astonishing that there are only 2 really proper murder mystery stories in the classic series. Although the Moonbase kind of starts off as one.
Oh, was he talking about Terror of the Bird Voice?
I would imagine so, but I think Moonbase has to make a third in there.
Yeah.
Philip Hinchcliffe votes it joint second with Masker Mandragora, says a tightly plotted, futuristic whodunit, brilliantly directed by Michael Bryant, all done in the studio. Thanks for your comments, Philip. Lovely to have you voting in our poll. The Robots of Death is great. It's only because the Talons of Weng-Chiang is in this season that it's not my favourite of the season. Yeah, I think that the reveal of the villain, yes, you're kind of down to only a couple of suspects by this point, but you know, that's kind of a function of how this story works, is that it's not the reveal itself, but you're wondering who can get bumped off before the villain gets revealed, I think, rather more than the whodunit aspect. And yeah, I think the sort of helium ending is perhaps a little bit silly, but then it's Doctor Who, and Doctor Who getting a little bit silly, especially during Tom Baker era, is not a problem. And I think the sort of giving away the villain beforehand by showing him on screen, even with the special effect, probably on smaller tellies when you could only watch it once back in the 1970s, wasn't as egregious a decision as it might seem now. Apart from that, though, the characterization and the backstories that Chris Boucher is writing in this, no wonder there's been so many different types of spin-offs of it afterwards. It feels like a really rich universe, acted by some terrific actors. And you really sort of, this is one of those stories where you go in and I think you really feel that it's really happening, despite the fact that it's clearly all taking place on television sets. And some of the special effects at the end of episode 2 and start of episode 3, I don't think the special effects of the Sand Miner are all that much, to be honest. Nice models, but you know, they're never obviously anything other than models. But the characters and the actors and the dialogue draws you so into the story, you don't really care about any of that stuff. What do you think, Matt?
I think it's one of the not few. There are quite a few stories that do this, but it makes such a plus out of being filmed indoors in the studio. I think this is one of those that, and there are some Doctor Who stories that could have done with being filmed indoors. But this is sort of one that really, and again, it's a design thing. I think you're right that the whodunit, the idea of this being a kind of Agatha Christie whodunit, is sort of over, has sort of skewed our perception of it. It's not really an Agatha Christie. It's actually a sort of giallo slasher movie.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
the identity doesn't matter. We're presented with this kind of crew of interesting characters, and we're basically wondering how they're going to be bumped off and in what inventive ways they're going to be bumped off. And that's
in what
and
order
that's what happens.
really is. Yeah. Is the one that we care about going to make it to the end? Is what we're really supposed to think.
So the presentation of the villain at the end is less about, oh my god, Dax, so as a spoiler alert, Dax was the villain all the time. It's actually, how are they going to take a fairly normal looking character and make him insane? So what's his insane acting going to be like? And it's quite good. So I think that works.
And the motivations they give him and the other characters as well make it feel like perfectly plausible reveal.
Yeah, the robophobia stuff with what's his name? Actor's name is
Sapphire's friend.
Yeah, David Collins.
Silver.
David Collins. Yeah. That whole robophobia season, that's the bit that sticks out to me. I never read the book, but I got this quite early on
book's terrible
on video. But that scene is so well performed. So yeah, it's really good, and coupled with this kind of robot design, which I think is right that they haven't brought back, because I think it probably works in this environment, in this type of story. I think you put it somewhere else and they might not work so well. It's the fact that their costumes match the sets and the environment and the costumes of the actors, the humans as well. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah, the only way you could really bring them back is just by remaking the story, essentially.
Oh, and I like the helium ending. It's sort of a kind of a Hartnell ending, because there's a bit of sort of science education in there as well. So I think that's fine, and it's sort of such a kind of tricksy ending. It's such a kind of almost low key ending that it balances out the kind of the slashiness of the rest of it.
Well, everything else is all about the concept, right? And the execution of the concept. That when it comes to the end, you need something that's right out of the box and that's not technological. And so to have this really sort of techno story end on such a non-techno note, even though if you boil it down to its sort of basic elements, it's all about science, because it's about, this gas, this chemical element. So yeah, it's appropriate in a really bad way.
Yeah.
And I suppose, in this period of Doctor Who, that's the best way to end a story. Season 14 then, any final thoughts?
Well, that last 10 episode run, the Robots of Death and Tunnels of Weng-Chiang, it's got to be high amongst the consistent run of episodes. I don't think it has the. I think it is really good. I mean, it's difficult trying to talk about even the worst stories in this season are difficult, because you remember bits of them that you really like. And it all comes down to, it just looks like they've spent money on it. It just looks like they got the right person to design the sets. And I think the costumes, is it Jim Aitchison?
Jim Aitchison, yeah. Aitchison, I think.
Aitchison. So I know he does The Deadly Assassin, but I think he does others as well.
I think he does quite a bit, yeah.
I mean, you get people of his kind of Oscar-winning quality and pre-Oscar-winning quality. That's what you need. It's not just about the writing, it's not just about the direction, it's not just about the acting. By chance, these are all good in these stories. It's also about the other people working on the series taking it seriously, not just being kind of BBC light entertainment, kind of doing it as a routine thing. They're actually thinking about these as exciting stories and trying to work together. And it speaks to a sort of a consistency in the production team. This is the period, and Barry Letts had a bit of this, but it feels like they've got a production team that's working together. It's not like Trial of the Time Lord, where you've got a production team that's tearing itself apart, and you can see that on the screen. This is where you can see the behind the scenes, the happiness of the people behind the scenes really working.
I think what happens with Barry Letts is he comes in and he says, right, let's do Doctor Who let's think about how we do Doctor Who, and do Doctor Who in the most thoughtful and rounded way that we can. So we'll think about the first story being a premiere. We'll think about the last story being a finale. We'll think about themes that run through the series and all this kind of stuff. So Barry Letts does a really thoughtful version of Doctor Who that's still exciting and colourful and dynamic and consistent. But he's doing Doctor Who. I think Philip Hinchcliffe comes in, and what he says is, they've made me do this programme, so I will stick to the limits of this programme only insofar as I have to, but I'll do a different programme instead. And I think it's telling that this season starts with the Mask of Mandragora and ends with the Talons of Weng-Chiang, because I think what Philip Hinchcliffe wants to be doing is something else. Something more like maybe the classic serials or a police series. So the Robots of Death is a bit more like a story you might have in a police series. Deadly Assassin is the kind of stuff that, you know, it's a political thriller. It's not really got anything to do with Doctor Who and space and sci-fi and stuff. I think Philip Hinchcliffe looks at Doctor Who and says, well, we have to keep villains and we'll give them masks to make them look like aliens. But to all intents and purposes, season 13 and 14 really aren't anything to do with the sci-fi, despite the fact that they sometimes import writers who'll come up with hard sci-fi, high concept storylines, premises, but actually the plots and the stories themselves aren't really to do with the sci-fi. And I think that's what distinguishes these 2 years. I don't think season 12 is the same, because they come to that with a lot of the stuff that Barry Letts and Terrence Dicks had set up for them. But 13 and 14, I think, stand out by being the least Doctor Who of all the Doctor Who seasons, despite the fact that they were so ubiquitous in the sort of extemporary media, the books, the Target books, and the way the magazines and the record, the Genesis of the Daleks record, we remember them as being the most Doctor Who of all Doctor Who, but I think ultimately they're the least Doctor Who of all Doctor Who. And I think they kind of spoil the rest of the series for us, because a lot of us grew up with these, and so therefore think of everything else as being just slightly lesser. And that is partly because of the quality of these, but partly also because of their antithetical nature to the rest of the series, I think.
And also there's such a strong period, and they are so distinctive compared with what's gone before. They do kind of ruin the series, because at a certain point the producers, the makers, tried to get back to what they were. They tried to recapture it. I mean, even in the new series there's talk of some stories, and the sort of the tonal instructions is Hinchcliffe the SH1T out of this one, and that kind of works if you get the right writer. You can see that, you know, there is a darkness to it, or a sort of black comedy to it. It doesn't work in the hands of the kind of 1980s script editors, because it just, there's no humor to it. I think even though this is quite a serious season, I think there's still a humor to this that there isn't in Attack of the Cybermen or Earthshock or Revelation of the Daleks. Revelation of the Daleks maybe comes closest, but has other flaws. So this is where it gets that balance right, and that's Robert Holmes. I mean, Robert Holmes is a master of recognizing where this humor is and how dark to take it before being taken off the air.
Right, Matt, that's season 14 then. We've come to the end of our journey. No more seasons to talk about in our reviews, but we are doing the poll of winners. So all the stories, 41 of them that have won the season polls that we've done, are up on our Facebook page, or there are other ways that you can vote. If you will follow us on Twitter, find us on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and that voting will go to more or less the end of March, because we're going to record the episode that runs down our poll of winners, I think on the 2nd of April or thereabouts, and that is our 10th anniversary. Until that happens, I was JR.
I was Matt.
And we will speak again soon.